Well, a couple of hours after the president landed in Brussels today for a NATO summit to be followed by a visit to London where he will meet the Queen and then a private one-on-one meeting with Vladimir Putin in Helsinki, the United States Senate had a roll call vote that was almost unanimous, and that is the same United States Senate that is paralyzed by party divisions more extreme than we have ever seen in the Senate's modern history. That same divided Senate voted 97-2 to, in effect, rebuke the President of the United States today. Here is what provoked the Senate to act today.
They're going, will President Trump be prepared? You know, President Putin is KGB and this and that. You know what? Putin's fine. He's fine. We're all fine with people.
Putin's fine. Democratic Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island didn't like hearing that.
And let's be clear, President Putin is not, quote unquote, fine. As recently reaffirmed by the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, in which I sit, President Putin directed an attack on our 2016 elections with the intent of undermining public confidence in our democratic process.
That is just some of what Senator Reed said when he rose on the Senate floor today to introduce language to be attached to a defense authorization bill. Senator Reed is the senior Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, and so that means he is the Democrats' floor manager on this bill. And it was in that role, as the floor manager of that bill, that he introduced language to be attached to the bill to, quote, reaffirm the commitment of the United States to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance as a community of freedom, peace, security, and shared values, including liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. Jack Reed introduced that language at the end of a day that was full of Trump attacks against NATO, including false statements on Twitter about the financing of NATO, and the president tweeting repeatedly about NATO. And so, after the president spent the day attacking NATO on his way to the NATO summit, Democratic Senator Jack Reed rose on the Senate floor, a member of the seemingly powerless Democratic minority in the United States Senate, and introduced language to attach to a bill that would rebuke everything that the president said today about NATO. And Democrat Jack Reed got 97 votes on the Senate floor today against everything that the president has been saying about NATO. There was more in the language of the Senate that the Senate attached to that bill today, more of that language, including reaffirming, quote, the ironclad commitment of the United States to its obligations under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty to the collective self-defense of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance. The Senate reaffirmed today in that language that the United States would rush to the defense of any member of NATO that comes under attack. Mitch McConnell voted for that direct disagreement with the president. Every Republican voted for that, except the two Republicans who sometimes call themselves libertarians, Rand Paul and Mike Lee. And every Democrat voted for that. The language that 97 senators voted for today went on to endorse, quote, long-term strategy using all elements of United States national power to deter and, if necessary, defeat Russian aggression. The Russian aggression that Donald Trump pretends doesn't exist. And that language made a demand of the president in dealing with Russia. The language attached to the bill now says that it calls on the administration to urgently prioritize the completion of a comprehensive whole-of-government strategy to counter malign activities of Russia that seek to undermine faith in democratic institutions in the United States and around the world, and to submit that strategy to Congress without delay. 97 senators voted for that rebuke of the Trump administration and its relations with Russia. A display of bipartisanship unlike anything we have seen in recent memory. And on the Senate floor today, Jack Reed explained something about NATO that everyone in the Senate already knows, but the president does not seem to understand.
The United States participates in NATO because we believe the transatlantic partnership is in the U.S. national security interest and not because other countries are paying us for protection.
And that was a very direct rebuke to what the president said this morning on his way to Air Force One.
NATO has not treated us fairly, but I think we'll work something out. We pay far too much, and they pay far too little. So I have NATO, I have the UK, which is in somewhat turmoil, and I have Putin. Frankly, Putin may be the easiest of them all. Who would think? Who would think?
No one would think. No one would think Putin is the easiest to deal with, and no one in the United States Senate would think that Putin is the easiest head of state that President Trump will deal with this week. This morning, the European Council President Donald Tusk directed these remarks at President Trump as he was on his way to the NATO summit.
Dear President Trump, America does not have and will not have a better ally than Europe. Dear America, appreciate your allies. After all, you don't have that many. Please remember about this tomorrow when we meet at the NATO summit, but above all when you meet President Putin in Helsinki. It is always worth knowing who is your strategic friend and who is your strategic problem.
Leading off our discussion now, David Corn, Washington Bureau Chief for Mother Jones, co-author of the best-selling book Russian Roulette, and an MSNBC political analyst. Ruth Marcus is with us, deputy editorial page editor and columnist for the Washington Post. She's an MSNBC contributor. And David Leonhardt, op-ed columnist for the New York Times, is also joining us. And Ruth Marcus, I wanted to begin with you with this vote that we saw on the Senate floor today, 97 votes, basically rebuking the president's Twitter feed for the previous several hours and just about everything the president has to say publicly about Vladimir Putin.
So it's astonishing in this Senate that you could get 97 votes for anything that goes beyond naming a post office. But I think what's even more astonishing is that it's necessary, right? Who would have thought that you would have to have the Senate explaining to a president of the United States about the role of NATO, the importance of NATO, and the need to take action against a country that interfered in your election? That's where we are. Remember, a year ago, we were all in a tizzy about whether the president would reaffirm the NATO commitment to go to the defense of other countries, that other NATO allies were under attack, and whether he would say the magic words. Now, we're not worried that he's going to fail to say the magic words. We're just worried that he's going to blow the whole darn thing up. And that is why you get 97 very alarmed senators.
David Leonhardt, your newspaper reporting about the Trump-Putin telephone relationship, saying during a phone call with Mr. Putin in March, Mr. Trump, he told Mr. Putin that Russia and the United States should get along better, and he described as stupid people the unnamed Trump administration officials whom the Russian president said had tried to prevent the call from happening, according to a person with direct knowledge of the conversation, which sounds like H.R. McMaster. You always have to be concerned about those people who've left the administration with knowledge of conversations like that. But David, the idea that the president is having these phone calls with Vladimir Putin and basically disowning the people who work for him in the White House.
Disowning his own aides, disowning all of Congress, disowning decades of American policy. I mean, what is so alarming about this is if you ask yourself, what would Vladimir Putin want Donald Trump to be saying? What would he want him to be saying out on that White House driveway? What would he want him to be tweeting? Donald Trump is consistently doing basically exactly what Vladimir Putin would want him to do in terms of his public statements. I have no idea why that is, right? That's part of what the Mueller investigation is trying to get at whether there really is some kind of leverage that Russia has has over Trump. We have no idea. But day after day after day, Trump does things that are damaging to the interests of the United States of America, damaging to our allies, and really quite helpful to Vladimir Putin and Russia.
David Corn, after almost 2 years of this presidency now, or approaching the second year of it, are we any closer to understanding why Donald Trump views Vladimir Putin this way?
Yes and no. I mean, some of it might be quite simple. In the book that I did with Michael Isikoff, we talk about Trump's desire to do business in Russia over a couple decades, and that certainly led him to want to curry favor with Putin. Probably, we don't know, but he's probably not trying to do business right at this moment, although he did during the campaign. But I think he has a psychological affinity for Putin. When he took the Miss Universe contest there in 2013, he's tweeted out, "Will Putin become my new best friend?" This is a thug who committed human rights abuses, election fraud. It was right before Ukraine, but you had a lot of reasons to not want this guy as a friend. And in the run-up to the summit now, we see him tweeting that Russia says they didn't meddle in our election, and as you showed, him calling Putin a fine person. What's happening is that both Trump and Putin are engaging in the same cover-up. They're both trying to cover up Russia's attack on the 2016 election. It's you know, I don't want to light my hair on fire, Lawrence, but seriously, the President of the United States is legitimizing Russian disinformation to protect Moscow after it attacked the United States. To me, the 97-0 vote in the Senate, while fine, doesn't go nearly far enough to address the seriousness of the situation.
And Ruth Marcus, your newspaper, Washington Post, reporting that some White House officials worry that Putin, who has held several calls with Trump, plays on the president's inexperience and lack of detailed knowledge about issues while stoking Trump's grievances. It's not us, Putin has told Trump, the official summarized. It's the subordinates fighting against our friendship. And Ruth Marcus, those subordinates are leaking profusely to the Washington Post and the New York Times about their worries about the president meeting with Vladimir Putin.
Well, we have seen time after time how easily President Trump is manipulated, including manipulated by foreign leaders. One of the best ways to manipulate him is to flatter him and to tell him how wonderful and good he is. He is ignorant of a lot of historical facts, so you start to explain to him, for example, that Crimea really should be part of Russia, and he's like, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense to me. Putin is, of perhaps all the foreign leaders, the most adept at manipulating. He's dealt with many U.S. presidents, and he is just in the catbird seat with Trump. And the notion that they could be meeting without any other officials or aides present just should scare the heck out of not just 97 senators, but all of us.
And David, the president will surely be discussing sanctions with Vladimir Putin's attempt to get rid of those sanctions. But this is the only president in history who, in effect, has applied sanctions to the European Union through tariffs. This is a president who has illegally imposed tariffs on the European Union, claiming a national security purpose for those tariffs, which is the only legal way of doing it. That is both a violation of the law directly, it's a violation of international law, it's a violation of the World Trade Agreements that we are a part of. And this president is going to be in a discussion with those European leaders. They have to decide for themselves, apparently, how they're going to deal with him on tariffs, or whether there's even a way to deal with him on tariffs.
And what's so crazy about those tariffs is they undermine another part of Trump's trade policy. So Trump is also levying tariffs on China, which, while they're not the smartest way to go about it, with China, there's actually a real problem there. China has been doing all kinds of bad stuff on the world stage, stealing intellectual property, subsidizing their own businesses, not letting other countries into their market. And so Trump talks tough about China, but the real way to be tough on China would be to come up with an alliance with Europe. Europe, and together have Europe and the United States say to China, you guys are too big and powerful to be cheating as much as you are. And instead what Trump has done is he's picked all these fights with Europe that you've mentioned, levying these tariffs on Europe really for no reason, sort of made up problems between the U.S. and Europe and how they levy tariffs on us. And so it undermines what is a much more serious issue in trade, which is how to go after the role that China is playing today. And of course, in the process, it also ends up hurting a whole bunch of U.S. companies and U.S. consumers. So it's just really a big loser for the U.S. economy and a big loser for the U.S. on the geopolitical stage.
David Corn, we will, I suppose, never be able to trust what was actually said in the one-on-one meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Can't trust Donald Trump's account of it, can't trust Vladimir Putin's account of it. That leaves us with the translators. They will be getting chased for the rest of their lives by reporters and historians trying to figure out what these two actually did say to each other. And there's the question of how much can we trust the translators? We just may never know.
I don't think so. It's like that great song from Hamilton. No one was in the room where it happened. And as Ruth so aptly described, it really seems like Putin has the upper hand, at least psychologically, in playing Trump. Trump, fawns over this guy. He wants acceptance from Putin. He sees the world as a club that he and Putin perhaps can rule together, and he shows nothing but dismissiveness towards our allies who share our values, whether it's Germany or Canada or a number of other countries. And so, I mean, we're kind of at the mercy here, not of Trump, but almost of Putin, who I think has the ability to turn Trump against his own staff, against American interests, certainly, and against our allies.
David Corn, David Leonhardt, thank you for starting off our discussion tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.